I'm going to talk to you about raccoons, which everyone seems to be obsessed with in Toronto. I also work with elephants in Africa, which is a whole other source of human-wildlife conflicts, which we don't have to deal with. But for me, everything is looking at brains. So I'm a psychologist, but I study animal brains. And I'm interested in how animals think, what they think about, how could they possibly think, what do they think in images, those kinds of questions. And what they're thinking, how they're thinking impacts their behavior. So that's, you're going to see my way of thinking come out in my talk. I'm basically going to tell you raccoon stories. That's what I'm doing, so just be prepared. So I'm going to talk about several topics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about urban raccoon territory sizes, and then I'm going to talk about the urban versus rural raccoons. And then I'm going to add in some recent research that I've done just looking at GTA residents' attitudes towards raccoons and maybe how that impacts wildlife management. I'm talking to Joanna about that a lot today. So I love this picture because this is a raccoon at a Blue Jays game, which I think is awesome and sort of illustrates that raccoons are everywhere in the GTA. They are in places you would not expect them to be, and I just think this is an awesome photo, just the way that it's just so attentively looking at the field makes me laugh. But we actually don't know as much as we might think we do about urban raccoons. So it's very important to get some basic data, which we still don't really have, on where they live and how many there are. Density issues are tough with raccoons. We don't really know what the density is. Some people say there's 100 per square kilometer. Some people say there's 300 per square kilometer. Rural animals, there's many, many fewer per square kilometer. We know that for sure. I'm going to tell you the story of how I came to study raccoons in this way, because the first step became important after CBC, Nature of Things, and PBS Nature, was a co-production, approached me to stand on camera and give the little spiel about raccoons as an animal. And so I said, well, I could do that because I work with them at the zoo, but we really don't know very much about them. And CBC and PBS said, well, if we gave you some money, could we learn more about them? I'm like, oh yes, please, let's do that. So actually, my current grad student, Mark Dupuy-Desormeaux, and I, and Graham Crawshaw, who's the senior veterinarian at the zoo, got together and did a project, radio collaring 5 raccoons. Now you say 5 raccoons, that's all we could afford. There were $5,000 each, these collars, and that's what PBS gave us to do. So we set these collars, and Justin's very aware because he's seen the data as well. We set these collars for a very fine resolution. So we got data uploaded every 20 minutes so we could see where these animals were. And in an urban setting, you really need to do that because if you do it every hour, they could be, way far away from where they were, and you don't really get any information about where they spend their time. So we had a very detailed look at where they spend their time. And I'm just saying this as to set the stage for the rest, but they have between 9 and 11 den sites on average that we found anyway. And so as a homeowner, if you're going to remove a raccoon from one den site, they're just going to have another one. And if you may see a raccoon one day, you might not see them the next day because they're in a different den site. But what we found is that they spend all their time in about 3 square blocks, and they rarely cross major arterial roads, which is good for them because if they do, they get squashed. So the raccoons who have survived in the city have learned don't cross major roads, so their territories are actually very small, overlapping territories. Many, many raccoons will overlap with each other, which has social implications for them. And they find all of their resources for their whole lives in those few blocks. The idea that people put them back in parks made me laugh because, of course, when you look at where they actually live, they don't live in the parks. The parks have nothing for them. They may go in the parks, they look in the garbage cans, but then they come back to your backyard at night. That's where they live. They don't live in the parks. So we learned that, and that was really cool. And we did this thing called Raccoon Nation. It was a nice documentary, and yay. But that was it. And I started thinking, okay, so these urban raccoons are in these very small areas. They live there for their whole lives. Urban and rural raccoons have not interbred. They don't interbreed. It's not like rural raccoons are getting on the subway and coming downtown. They are completely separated populations. And so it was really interesting to me to think about, is the urban environment creating a smarter raccoon? Our structures are actually challenging those animals who are going to survive. The animals that are going to survive are going to have to figure out our structures, which are becoming increasingly more complicated. And so my hypothesis was that the urban environment is actually resulting in a divergence in cognitive abilities, again in the psychology, between the urban and the rural animals. And so that's what I wanted to look at. Luckily, National Geographic Society, which I love with all my heart, also wanted to look at that. So they funded me to do a crazy study, which I did on my own. I have no students doing this. I thought, I'm going to do this crazy study. It's mine. It's nuts. I'm going to do it. No one else can be blamed for it but me. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. So I wanted to come up with problems that these two populations could solve. I didn't want to come up with unusual things that I had to build. Why? Because I needed like 60 of each of the things, the tasks. So I came up with going to the Home Depot and figuring out what I could buy cheaply, multiple examples of it. So I made up two tasks. One was the hanging bucket. It's really a garbage can, a little garbage can hanging upside down. This is a novel task. Raccoons have never seen this before. No one's ever seen this before. I just made this up. It's insane. So I'll show you a picture in a second. It's a novel task. The food is located at the solution point of this task. I'm a psychologist. I think about solution points for tasks and strategies for tasks. The second task is a very familiar task. It's the garbage can. Garbage can with a bungee cord. Yep, we all seen that. We all use that to keep raccoons out. Not so much in the city of Toronto because we have different garbage cans, but certainly in rural areas, that's the thing that's used to keep raccoons out. The thing about a garbage can is if you put food in the bottom of a garbage can, the food is not located at the solution point. The solution point is at the top of the can. So although it seems like a very simple task, it's not. There are two steps to this task. The other task I created has one step to solution. So I put up motion camera, infrared camera traps and set them out all over the place. I had many dozens of camera traps set up and left overnight, and I'll show you where in a minute, but first I'll just show you. This is a very bad schematic I drew of the hanging task. I can show you video later. I unfortunately don't have access to the internet, so I can't show you my videos, which I hope to do. But basically it's an upside down garbage can with food in the middle, and the animal has to either come from the top to get it or go underneath, but the food is located in a little cup which they can pull down. And it's always 25 centimeters above the substrate, so it swings, which I thought might make them a little bit nervous. I'm nervous at all. The second one is a garbage can. There you go. That's a garbage can in my backyard. It's a lovely Rubbermaid garbage can with a bungee cord. These are two tasks, very simple. So a lot of this. A lot of raccoons coming up and look at me. In urban areas, you get a lot of cats, you get a lot of raccoons. In the rural areas, I got bears like crazy coming up and looking at me, which scared me, I have to be honest, when I was out there by myself, because again, I did this study by myself. So often I was out at night in my vehicle and just waiting to get the cameras in, and I would wonder why it would get very quiet. And then I would look at the thing and say, oh, it's because the bears are there, and it was disturbing. But I did see a lot of bears. There's a lot of bears out there. So they did get into my tasks. This is hard to see for you, but mostly you can just take away that this is the urban map. So the little red marks are where I had camera traps set up. One of them is Gail's backyard. Thank you, Gail. They're all over Toronto, taking into account that a raccoon territory is about 3 square blocks. I had to make sure they were at least 3 square blocks away from each other. Usually they were much more than that. So I had very nice friends who said, yeah, you can put your stuff up in my backyard. So I did it all over the GTA. And this is a map of the rural areas. Now I chose rural areas as areas that had human habitation, but that had no regular garbage collection. That was a criterion I thought was important. This routinized garbage collection, I think, does train animals to come to garbage, whereas in rural areas that's not the case. I did have some areas that were completely rural, so they were on islands and no humans nearby. But I did want to have the animals that were not afraid of approaching novel objects, and I did see that the ones that were in completely rural areas that had no humans were very hesitant to approach the objects. Even the ones that had human habitation were quite hesitant. So you can see this is all over all over southern Ontario, going into eastern Ontario as well. So I had several areas. I just drove back and forth between these. I spent 2 field seasons doing this. The first season I thought, oh, I'll get it all done in a month, yeah. And it was there was a distemper outbreak among the rural animals, and there were very few animals to be seen. In fact, I saw like 2 raccoons all summer, that summer. So I had to do it again. So I have over 800 hours of video. If anybody wants to see them, happy to share 800 hours of video that I had to go through. I could only use the data on the first time an animal attempted a task, because I'm not looking at the learning of these tasks, I'm looking at how do they approach a new task, so it's a new problem. So sometimes I'd have a camera up in a remote area for a few nights. I could only use the ones from the first night when I could identify an individual animal, which is not as easy as you might think with raccoons. They all look very similar. So after all those hours of video, I got 22 animals from rural areas and 22 urban animals that I could say for sure these are distinct individuals. This is the first time they've seen this task, and I could compare the data. It's a lot of work. Oh my God, I didn't sleep for 2 years. So here we go. So I'll show you data from urban raccoons first. You can't see the bottom, but the first is task 1, so that is the hanging bucket. The first is the attempts of the hanging bucket. The second is the solution of the hanging bucket. You'll see that all the urban raccoons figured out the hanging bucket. They had no problem attempting this. They didn't all solve it instantly. Sometimes it took them a long time, but they come back and they persist until they solved it. The second task, the garbage can with the bungee cord. You see the attempts. Everybody attempted the garbage can with the bungee cord, but not everybody solved a garbage can with the bungee cord. Again, in the city of Toronto, we have different bins, and so they're not necessarily used to garbage cans with bungee cords, but most of them that did try it did eventually get into it. The longest, so I recorded not only if they got in or not, but what they did and how long they took. The longest I saw was one female spent 6 hours trying to get into a garbage can. And the person whose house it was is a good friend of mine, and she said, I'm really sorry, there were no raccoons in there last night. And then I looked at the video, and in fact the raccoon had gotten into the can and gotten out of the can and didn't disturb the can. After 6 hours, it was exactly where it was. She didn't hear it, so I showed her the video, and she was like, no way. It was amazing. So usually the animals knocked the cans over and then pried them open. That was their strategy. But some managed to leave the can intact and get in and get out and leave no trace, which was incredible. Yeah, a female that spent 6 hours out, that was my ultimate favorite animal. Most of them with the bucket would figure that out in a few minutes, because it's pretty easy. You just go under the bucket or you pull the bucket down. Again, I have video I can show you later. They get it on their head and they're just up there and they pull it down. The larger ones would just pull the whole thing down to get the food. But the garbage can really tested their little brains, which I didn't expect, but was really cool to see. I have a really nice 20-minute sequence that I can show you if you're interested, where a whole bunch of them get into one can. All the babies get in, the adult gets in, everybody gets in, and then they don't know what to do because they're stuck in the can. Awesome. So that's the urban raccoons. Now here is the cool part. So rural raccoons, task 1, hanging bucket. So we have 8 of 22 attempted it, so not as many attempted it. The ones that attempted it, they all solved it. So simple task, they all solved it. The second task, the can, more of them attempted it, but 0 were able to solve it. 0. Not one animal got into these cans. And I thought, oh well, I must be looking at it. No. I would go back to these cans. Sometimes I'd left them up for a week or so, and they were full of cat food. Disgusting, because the cat food would just putrefy, because no animal would get into them at all. They would typically walk around the can. So they smell the food at the bottom. They concentrated their searching at the bottom, as opposed to the urban ones that would go, they could smell the food, and they would immediately try to get in any place that they could do or knock over the can. But the rural ones never, ever did that. And not like just a couple, no, 0 of them attempted, and 0 of them got into these cans. I was flummoxed, personally. These are non-overlapping distributions. It's like 2 different species here. They didn't figure it out, and then they did attempt it. So this is just graphically showing them together. So you can see the rural ones are in blue, and they attempted less, but they also didn't succeed at all. And the urban ones attempted everything, and they mostly succeeded, even on the more difficult task. So again, non-overlapping distributions. So in general, the urban raccoons were less neophobic than their rural counterparts. So they weren't afraid to approach new things, which you would expect, they're urban animals. They were much more likely to try different strategies, and they were much more persistent. So you did not see a rural animal spending 6 hours on a task. They can't. They won't survive. They need to go find other resources. In the urban environment, they can. They have time on their hands. They have, they've been fed. Some of them are very fat. They can spend time. They can work at this garbage can, to get a can of cat food. Whereas you can't do that if you're a rural animal. And also, you don't do that if you're a rural animal. So, this is a nice little story showing, wow, urban animals much smarter than their rural counterpart. Now, it might be that they're not smarter. They certainly have different behavioral strategies. Is this due to experience and that they've been rewarded for behaving this way? Or is this due to genetics? Well, I don't know. Nobody knows, but we'll have to find out. This is my gratuitously cute picture of a baby raccoon. Oh, they're so cute. The only way to really figure this out is to look at young raccoons that haven't had any experience foraging on their own. So that's what my study will be this summer, is to compare problem solving in those two populations, rural and urban young/infant raccoon. And the tasks obviously won't be the same, but they can be modified to see how they approach them, to see if they're born with these differences or not. Certainly, I did have young animals attempting the tasks that I did have up, and the young animals in the urban environment were just as successful as the older ones. The young animals in the rural environment were just ridiculously unsuccessful in a charming way. They're certainly just the anecdotal data enough to analyze enough kits in this experiment to analyze, but I suspect that these actually are genetic differences, and it would make sense because the urban animals have been separated from their rural counterparts for many, many, many generations. Cognitive evolution can take place. I think cognitive evolution is taking place. I do believe that the urban animals we are building smarter raccoons. Certainly the ones that survive will have to be able to adapt, and that's come up several times in people's talks today. So I think there are some aspects of that. However, raccoons are not evil geniuses. Everyone, I get all these calls from people. I know we all get calls from people about our various animals, but everyone's like, "Ooh, they're evil, and they're doing this on purpose, and they're destroying my house because they are evil and they hate me." And no, this is not true. They're not evil geniuses. I did try a lot of different tasks before I tried these two. I wanted tasks that there was a normal distribution of solutions. Some tasks are impossible for urban raccoons. If you put your garbage in a transparent container, you will freak them out. They see the garbage and they don't understand, so they go for what they see. And so they will, if you put garbage in the bottom of a transparent container, they will always go to the bottom. They completely lose their mind. They forget the idea. You turn it over and open it up. They don't do that. They just keep going, trying to get through. Transparent containers, highly confusing, not only for raccoons, but many other animals. Raccoons don't readily use tools. So I had one task where they could pull a string to get the food out. They don't use tools. They're not like crows. They can't figure that out. Confused, then they were chewing the string, and they do not know how to use that two-step process to get food out. And they do not plan ahead. So as I mentioned, there was funny examples of them getting stuck in garbage cans. This is a great example. A friend of mine showed me. She had put a rock on top of her green bin, and she thought, okay, I've got them. I've got a bungee cord, I got a rock, there's going to be nothing. No raccoon can get in. And she came out in the morning, and a raccoon got in. Couldn't get out because the rock was too heavy. So, they get into stuff, and then they get trapped in there. So they're not planning ahead. They're not thinking. They're not evil geniuses. They're not doing this to drive you crazy. They're just, they see the food. They want to get the food. They figure out how to get the food, and then they go, oopsie, I don't know how to get out of this can. So the fact that so many people were asking me these questions about raccoons, which I find psychologically interesting for the people, why would you project evil on an animal? I decided to do a survey of attitudes towards raccoons. So I got 1,629 respondents, which I was amazed at. People like to talk about raccoons. About half of them live in single-family houses, or whatever you want to call that, just not in apartments. Over 65% of the respondents live in the GTA a long time. Normal, equal distribution, gender distribution, normally distributed age distribution. And almost 60% think the GTA has a raccoon problem. I phrased it that way on purpose because that's what the city phrased it as, Rob Ford actually phrased that we had a raccoon problem. And a lot of people agree, we have a raccoon problem. And an overwhelming majority of those have experienced significant damage from raccoons, either minor or significant. So that's a lot of people that have had problems. I just put up one graph of data because I thought this might be interesting to this group. So these strategies have been suggested by the media as ways to deal with raccoons, with the raccoon problem. Removal, humane euthanasia, shooting, yes, that was one. Disruptive breeding, so that means hormonal or whatever. Raccoon-proof garbage bins, and none of the above. And you can see that most people are in the less invasive, kind of less severe categories, although some people picked a few. The number one predictor of increased severity of response, so the shooting and the, let's get these damn raccoons out of here kind of responses, which I got a lot of those, was the amount of damage. So if you suffer a significant amount of damage from raccoons, you want to kill them. That's as simple as, I did multiple regression, I did everything, I put all the factors in, it's damage. Unbelievable correlation. They damage your stuff, you want to hurt them. Isn't that interesting as humans that we want to punish those that damage our stuff? I think that's fascinating. I also have 873 written responses. When I say written, I mean sometimes thousands of words. The lovely colleague at Ottawa, Jeffrey Spooner, who's analyzing those qualitatively, because I don't know how to do that. And it is extraordinary how people want to talk about raccoons and tell you about raccoons and what they think about raccoons. So the next steps are to do a hotspot analysis of the damage that people have reported. Once I can figure out how to do that, I will do that. And then I've also been talking to Joanna and others about looking at the effect of the new green bins on raccoon density. I actually was the one who tested the green bins, so that was mentioned yesterday by Virginia, actually. They were tested in my backyard, and none of the raccoons could get into those green bins. There were 3 prototypes, 3 different ones. They were all raccoon-proof. They really are. They were raccoon-proof. It's not that they're outwitting the raccoons, it's their physical, they can't physically open those bins. They're a different size. They can't get them open. So I think it's awesome. I think we're still going to have a lot of issues with raccoons. I think we need some more data. So that seems to be the take-home message for me is we need more data. What's the density of raccoons? Where are they in the city? Where are they causing the problems? What's the effect of these new green bins? Are we going to have dead raccoons all over the streets? Are we just going to have smaller litter sizes? What's going to happen? Distemper, as we see, is ravaging population this year. How's that going to impact the density of raccoons? So we have a lot of work to be done. It's fascinating work, and I'm happy to have any comments. So if you'd like to, please do reach me anytime. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. It looks like we already have a couple questions brewing. Anyway, start with you.
Sure.
Thank you for the talk. I guess I'm just like, I don't know, I'm wondering what this word intelligence, and it's like, it seems to me that, I mean, I granted that the raccoons in the urban area haven't faced the particular problem that you set up. It doesn't seem obvious that they haven't been presented with schema or like situations in some way that they developed schema that then give them a head start to those solutions, and that, if you had done a different type of experiment with more like naturalized context with a naturalized problem, which one would solve it? Like, it seems to me like it's reproducing the problem or the criticism of IQ tests with humans, where there's like a cultural bias. And I'm wondering if there was something easier, like if you could just, like, I don't know, assuming there's a correlation between brain size and intelligence.
There isn't.
There isn't. Well, okay. Because there, so I guess I'm wondering, do you think that Snell Rude's, are you familiar with Snell Rude?
No.
She's in Michigan, I think, and she's doing a study about almost the same question: is urbanization increasing the intelligence of rodents?
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
and she's looking at cranial capacity of skulls from like 100 years ago, comparing them with average now.
That has been done recently, but in different species, and in fact, it's not what you would expect. And
So she's cooking the data.
no, I don't. But there have been, people have said, okay, so urban animals should have, bigger brains, basically, because they have to deal with all these problems. They may, but it's not a simple relationship and it's not a linear relationship. So that's too simplistic, I think. And intelligence, obviously, we could talk for days about what that means. The reason that psychologists use these artificial problems is because for me, I had to clean them in between, so there had to be something I could clean. But you can compare that easy, we're actually looking at number of steps to solution. And so the easiest task that has one number of steps to solution is actually more novel.